Yes, good morning and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and today, of course, I'll be speaking with Stuart Parker and Aaron Ekman. It is Thursday after all, and we'll be doing our roundup of the news as well as some interpretation of it later on in the program. First and foremost, of course, we're going to be doing our endorsement. It's Resistance Coffee, as always. Resistance Coffee, of course, is based at Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and they are locally roasted here in Canada. They bring in the beans and they roast them here in Canada, and the big thing about Resistance Coffee is, of course, they don't support woke causes. So they don't skim something off the top and pay into woke causes that curtail your freedom. They actually go the other direction and help support those organizations that are trying to expand or preserve our heritage of liberty in Canada. If you use the promo code The Western Standard on your first purchase, you will get about 10% off. It's pretty great. So that's where we're starting off with today, but we're going to bring Aaron on right away, and he's going to tell us what's happening in the world. Aaron, what is going on?
I should start again by saying that what's going on in my house right now is that this cup of coffee is amazing, I have to say. It's
there it is. There it is.
and it's as you said in the outset, it's Resistance Coffee, and it's good stuff. They roast some pretty good beans out there in Saskatchewan, and I recommend that folks get a hold of it. I just also like to show off my mug, which I'm rather proud of. I think I found it at a Value Village somewhere or something. But
we should make sure that the other one of these gets out to you. That's I don't think they have any merch yet, so we got to figure out when this is going to happen. But
yeah, well, it looks like it's a little larger than mine. So if you can fit more Resistance Coffee into that mug, that's my kind of mug. That's great. That's really good.
Feel the resistance.
That's right. Now, as you know, we're on the cusp of a major heat wave here in British Columbia, so I do have my window open. So if my there's a chandelier hanging over my head, if it starts to blow around on me, I'll close the window. But people need to, I think, prepare for this coming weekend. It's going to be record high heats, and especially those of us in the north that aren't used to, really high temperatures. If you haven't got an air conditioner, make sure you get a couple of cheap fans and just blow the air through your house. I know a lot of people think that you're supposed to blow air from outside into your house during the day. The secret is to blow the hot air from inside your house out. So point the fans outside, blow the air out, try to get a breeze going through your house, close your blinds and your curtains during the day, open all your windows at night. I know it's for folks down south, that's pretty basic stuff. For those of us up here that aren't used to it, because when you're starting to get into the high 30s and early 40s, like they're talking about in the Soyuz in particular, people can start to die from that kind of heat. So that's my PSA message for the morning for Western Standard listeners.
It is important to actually realize that here we are up in northern British Columbia. The funny thing is that we just don't get heat like this, so we're just not used to it. Thank God it's a dry heat. Humidity alone just kills us. Like anybody who's watching us from the Great Lakes area or out towards Manitoba, some parts of Saskatchewan, but definitely Manitoba, Lake Country, and then out into Ontario. I can't, 20 in humidity kills me. Like I can do 28 in dry, but 20 in humidity is just I'm leaving.
Yeah. And I know, the regular warnings, of course, don't leave your kids in the car, don't leave your pets anywhere other than where they're supposed to be. And but I think that as we do the news roundups throughout the summer, it's going to start to shift to forest fires in the province. That'll be the big challenge for us.
We just got rid of masks. I don't want to put them on again.
No, I know. I mean, I was just, I was driving down to Vancouver last week. Because I haven't done that drive in, I think, over a year now, and I saw 3 or 4 helicopters dropping water bombs already. So I think it's going to be a bit of a rough, and that hits us hard. It hits the folks in the Caribou really hard. I mean, they've been evacuated now a couple of years running, and some of those businesses have never recovered, and so they went through that before the pandemic hit. So they need some help. They need some assistance from the government, and it's a good segue, I think, into one of the 3 stories that I wanted to highlight for you today in BC. We'd reported earlier on this channel about the InBC fund, which has been set up by the Minister of I can't remember what his full title is, Minister of Jobs and Innovation. Basically, I think that it's one of those ministries where the title changes each time there's a new government. But you've basically set up a $500 million investment fund to try to seed a bunch of British Columbian companies, sort of a venture capital venture. And what we'd reported on previously was that this particular fund had been removed from the same FOI regulations as everything else in government in BC, which is to say, if a reporter is interested in finding out for the public interest sort of how the money's being spent or where it's being spent or sort of what they're doing with it, they don't have the same ability to get that information. So that was troubling. There's some new news on that front, which is a little less troubling, I think. In fact, it might be a little bit encouraging, but we should probably approach with a bit of caution, at least critically. And that is that a fairly well-known internationally economist by the name of Mariana Mazzucato, she's an Italian-American economist with some international fame, has just been retained by the provincial government, by that ministry, to the tune of $350,000. And let me share my screen here, and I'll just show you the story on this. Go there. And there. Is that coming up?
BC hires UK economist to help save capitalism from itself.
Yeah, they describe her as a UK economist. She's working at the, I think it's the University College of London, but she's advised governments around the world, and she is I think she was born in Italy but has American citizenship. And it's interesting. I mean, the reason why I think this is interesting for British Columbians to pay attention to is because when a government hires an economist like this to advise them on some initiative, it says a lot about what direction economically the government wants to go in. I like that little rabbit hole.
That was pretty cool, actually.
I call it the infinity hole. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That was weird. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, that's what happens when you use this online broadcasting stuff. Anyway, I've got a little video that of her talking, and I have to apologize to folks. It's an excerpt from a TED Talk, and we were joking on the outset here that this is what we've descended to is running clips from TED Talks. But it's an opportunity for us to get a sense of sort of how she's going to advise the government. If I just sort of summarize it, she is basically she's basically she's not a socialist, I don't think. So folks that are worried about the kind of economists that the NDP might bring in from the left, for instance, I don't think they have anything to worry about. But she is a big advocate of more public, and by public I mean government involvement in innovation-related ventures, which is kind of perfect for, I mean, it sort of tells the story of what the provincial government's trying to do right now with this in BC fund. It's this idea that we need to incubate more BC businesses and try to expand our economic base to some degree. And so what she would argue, I think, if I can summarize it, and I have, full disclosure here, I haven't had it, I wasn't fully aware of her before the announcement, so I haven't had a chance to acquaint myself with her work. I intend to read some of her books. She's written rather extensively on this stuff. But she talks about how government has to play a role in seeding information. She talks a lot about what she calls the entrepreneurial state, etc. And so what the questions that pop up in my mind when I hear her talks and stuff is this another way of trying to redress the old P3 model, the private-public partnership model, where essentially government takes on all of the risk, hires a private company to do the work, they make a bunch of money, and in many cases, at the end of it, they also retain the operational rights, etc., and some of the ownership rights. And most of the risk is assumed by government and by extension the taxpayer. And I think her whole thesis is that's a problematic arrangement in the sense that BC taxpayers or any public taxpayers are required to assume most of the risk in these ventures and too little of the reward. So what she's advocating is if you're going to go down this road to try to seed and incubate private firms to build up your own economy, you have to do so in a way that British Columbians will reap the economic benefit from it and not assume all of the risk. Well, that's easy to say. How do you do it and still sort of attract the kind of businesses you need to do this work? And her thesis is, for those, I think, who would say that government is incapable of doing anything that's innovative whatsoever, she takes that thesis on head on. So if we just switch over to the video clip here, I'll just play a little blurb of her addressing this issue. We'll just wait for the producer to put it up on the screen there. It's already uploaded.
Who actually funded the really cool, revolutionary, thinking out of the box things in the iPhone? Well, what actually makes your phone a smartphone, basically, instead of a stupid phone? So the internet, which you can surf the web anywhere you are in the world, GPS, where you can actually know where you are anywhere in the world, the touchscreen display, which makes it also really easy to use phone for anybody. These are the very smart, revolutionary bits about the iPhone, and they're all government funded. And the point is that the internet was funded by DARPA, US Department of Defense. GPS was funded by the military's Navistar program. Even the Siri was actually funded by DARPA. The touchscreen display was funded by two public grants by the CIA and the NSF to two public university researchers at the University of Delaware. Now, you might be thinking, well, she's just said, the word defense and military an awful lot. But what's really interesting is that this is actually true in sector after sector and department after department. So the pharmaceutical industry, which I am personally very interested in because I've actually had the fortune to study it in quite some depth, it's wonderful to be asking this question about the revolutionary versus non-revolutionary bits, because each and every medicine can actually be divided up on whether it really is revolutionary or incremental. So the new molecular entities with priority rating are the revolutionary new drugs, whereas the slight variations of existing drugs, Viagra, different color, different dosage, are the less revolutionary ones.
So that's probably a good place to leave it. So you see, like, she makes the case that all of the most innovative parts of technology, both in the United States and around the world, and she talks a lot about sort of Silicon Valley firms, et cetera, all of the big tech giants, Google, Microsoft, et cetera. Her basic thesis is none of these things would have innovated to the degree they did without massive injections of publicly funded research, innovation, et cetera. And so what she's saying here is that you can't make, it's just not, it's a fallacy to say that all of this innovation just spawned from the private sector. And in fact, she references a bunch of clips from Bill Gates, et cetera, sort of in the early days, talking about how, how none of what they produced there would have been possible without this wave of public sector investment and research, et cetera. But the questions I have about this, it's not to say that I'm criticizing them retaining her. And, people might be concerned about the $350,000 price tag for her consultancy, I guess. It's really not a lot of money when you're talking about government projects like this, especially when you're talking about, trying to put together a plan on innovation for the province, et cetera. And it's not just her, it's also a team of 6 other economists, apparently, that'll be working with the ministry. But keep in mind, just to put it in context, when the BC NDP government first came in, they spent $2 million over 2 years on a UBC project to write a report on a universal basic income, the conclusion of which was, after the 2-year project was over, we don't really know. We should probably just continue doing what we're doing, kind of thing. That was $2 million. So this is a fraction of that. And so it'll be interesting to see whether the recommendations that she makes in terms of trying to create this entrepreneurial state to try to incubate BC-based businesses, et cetera, can be scaled down to the size of British Columbia, given that what she's usually talking about are these massive tech firms that have benefited from major statewide, state-level investment, et cetera. I guess the question is, does the BC government have the kind of capital she's talking about to be able to produce this level of innovation, which can help incubate these firms? And indeed, in the press conference she did yesterday, one of the first things she said was, "We don't want that yet."
Not yet.
One of the first.
Soon.
One of the first. Although I love seeing B.A. Johnson, but one of the first things that she said was, and directly to the minister when she was talking, was, this $500 million investment fund is not going to be enough in terms of doing what we want to do here. I've seen Ottawa fund revolutionary research by D&D transferred to private companies who sold it elsewhere. Yes, so I would argue, John, that's a fantastic point. I would argue that's sort of the traditional P3 model, and not just in military. That happens also in healthcare, happens in education. It certainly happens in construction. And I mean, like in Esquimalt, perfect example. I got a tour of the base down there a few years ago from one of the unions that was on site when I was Secretary Treasurer of the BC Fed. And for the last 50 years, the government has basically done most of its production through a private entity. I think it's called Public Works or something, but it's essentially a private corporation. And it's got its own profit margin. It doesn't, the revenue doesn't really come back to government, kind of thing. So it's kind of, it should be a Crown Corp system, I think, so that you've got the benefit of the public infrastructure, public involvement in the actual construction, but you also derive the benefit from it. Whereas if you do this P3 model, you basically, the taxpayer is assuming all the risk, and the private entity assumes all the gain and all the revenue. So the long and short of it is, hopefully, this economist, Mariana Mazzucato, will help the province better understand how British Columbian taxpayers can better benefit from large-scale infrastructure development projects, etc., in a way that BC taxpayers benefit, not just the private companies that are helping out. But of course, the private companies have to be able to profit somehow, otherwise they're not going to take on the contracts. So it'd be interesting to see whether there's any substance to this. The other sort of danger I think that comes up in my mind when I think about it is really, the minister's just sort of set up this $500 million investment fund to play around in some tech firms in BC, has hired this international economist to try to wrap some credibility around the project, but really nothing's going to change. But he has made some positive statements in regards to restructuring forestry and how the tenures are apportioned around the province with an aim to try to move away to some degree from the large three companies to smaller producers, and some indigenous producers. And if she's advising on that, that's great. The big question, of course, is, to what degree will this economist reinforce the importance of reestablishing our manufacturing base in British Columbia? Because that's not really her bailiwick from my perspective, in the limited amount that I've seen so far. And that it doesn't really matter how fancy we get in our investment strategy in BC, trying to incubate tech firms, etc. It really comes down to manufacturing and international trade for BC. It always has. And none of the other industries, whether they're service or tech related, are going to do very well if we haven't got that foundational base in our economy. So more to come, I'm sure.
More to come, I'm sure. I think that what occurs to me as I kind of listen to her, one, it's pretty clear that she's Italian. I'm part Italian too. I also like using my hands. But I think that something that became clear as well is that, like, this is someone who's fundamentally an optimist, a robust optimist, actually, when it comes to there are these things. I've seen it work before. It can work again, and we'll use that methodology. It's kind of like the bright side of what happens sometimes in conservative circles. There are conservatives who are very happy about what the dairy industry does, right? And like how we fixed all the dairy problems using the dairy industry, or very happy about, or even maybe in a more industry side of things, maybe or manufacturing, like de Havilland. Like when I put that hat on, I don't put that hat on a lot. I'm usually kind of a bit of a dreary, dour, cynical, kind of waiting for the apocalypse kind of guy in some respects. But when I do put the happy conservative hat on, I do reference these things. I mean, there's Viking Air in Victoria. They took up all of de Havilland's patents, and they're able to manufacture all the old beavers, and they still manufacture now a new Twin Otter, which is still the single greatest two engine STOL aircraft, short takeoff, short landing, aircraft. So we have these moments of optimism. And I'm hopeful that, and sometimes this is why I like talking to people on the left, because they actually have a vision of the future and they want to get us somewhere. Sometimes on the right, it's hard to find that. But I do worry that there's a lot of government debt that can be piled up very quickly on rabbit trails. I've got a monorail I'd be happy to sell you if you're going to give me $2 billion. And again, back to your point of public-private partnerships, I didn't understand why the bridge was tolled in Vancouver. I don't think I ever paid that toll, and I was playing the long game and I won. It wasn't worth my time. I had to underwrite the company that built that bridge. Why was I going to pay for it? That was nonsense. So this is the thing that kind of hits me. And should governments own patents? Is that how we should do revenue? Should governments essentially not have any tax base? They just have revenue bases because they own things? Maybe that's a better model. I don't know. It's a very hard discussion. It's a lot of complication.
And Mariana Mazzucato, I mean, she talks a lot about the inefficiency of patents in our current system, which is an interesting conversation. She talks about how basically the way a patent works is it's government extending a 20-year monopoly, and I think she talks about the American context mostly, to a private corporation. And the payback for that for the taxpayer apparently should be, according to her, would be that after the 20 years has expired, then the information gets to be disseminated, and that's the payoff. But her critique of that system is that it doesn't really work that way. But 20 years from now, if you're talking about innovation in particular, especially in the tech sector, I mean, 20 years from now, it doesn't matter. Nobody wants that tech anymore. It's probably been reverse engineered anyway by somebody else in the private sector. And so she talks about how really patents under the current regime are just a way to enforce monopolies and a way for government to award monopolies to big players as sort of a reward and a way to try to spur on innovation because it guarantees that income. Well, it does guarantee income for them, but as she shows through a lot of the data that she's put together over the years, it doesn't actually help innovation. She would argue that it impedes innovation. It gets in the way of innovation. And I think, that whatever your position is on vaccines or the pandemic, et cetera, how vaccines were developed in this sort of tempest that was taking place at the outset of the pandemic was a great little microcosm of how our system doesn't really work very well. In fact, I didn't pull up the video, but the most effective vaccine in the world, apparently, I think it's rated at 92%, where the others are I think in the 80s. The most effective vaccine was developed by Cuba. It was developed by the public sector in Cuba and is basically being distributed at very low cost around the world, mitigated only by their limited capacity to produce it because they've been under 5 or 6 decades of economic sanctions and blockade by the United States. And yet, despite all of those challenges, this tiny socialist country, 60 miles or whatever it is off the coast of Florida, was able to produce their own vaccine and was the first to get it out the door and start distributing it around the world, where the American companies, they were working furiously to try to come up with a vaccine that worked and test it to the degree that they could, but they're all hiding all that information from each other because their prime motive was not to help get people vaccinated, irrespective of what you think about that. Their prime motive was to make a buck and to make as much money as possible. So, people can say, well, that's fine. That's what their purpose is as private corporations, pharmaceuticals. And that's great. I mean, you can take that position. But again, I don't deal in right or wrong. I just deal in, what we do and what the consequences are of doing it. And if your goal was to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible, it doesn't make sense to have a bunch of big private pharmaceutical companies working in a siloed way from each other in secret, not sharing any information. I mean, how much would we have benefited, for instance, if people have concerns about the side effects of these vaccines, and there are some concerning side effects that are starting to emerge as they get more data, like heart inflammation is the latest thing that the CDC is reporting on in young individuals, for instance. Still a very low rate, and they still say that the possibility of you contracting some level of heart inflammation from COVID itself is a higher risk than from these vaccines. But wouldn't it have made more sense for these companies to share all that testing data in advance and everybody try to come up with work together to come up with a vaccine that is the highest level of effectiveness and the lowest level of side effects, et cetera, and then distribute it as far and wide as possible? Well, if that's your goal, then sort of the capitalistic free market system is not the most efficient way to do it. And I think that's her point. How does that scale to the British Columbian economy, given that we're a resource-based economy, we're an export-based economy, we don't have the same kind of capital that we can that another country has, that a whole nation has, that we can pile into research and innovation necessarily. But we do have a couple of, potentially very successful crown corporations. And of course, the one I always talk about is BC Hydro. So what I'm worried about in this case, and we'll watch it closely, is that they'll sort of get stars in their eyes about all these grand visions at a national scale that this economist will advise them on, and none of it will really be that applicable to what matters in British Columbia. But on the whole, I think it's far better than trying to bring in an economist like other governments have in the past, who just advocate that they conclude from the outset that government can't do anything right. Government should just get out of all business whatsoever and forego any opportunity to generate any non-tax based revenue, and privatize everything, including healthcare and education. And that's been very disastrous for British Columbia, so much so that Abbott, from one of the former leadership candidates of the BC Liberal government, who was a cabinet minister during the time that was happening, wrote a book saying, look, there was no plan and it was terrible, and there was drastic consequences as a result.
I mean, the ways that we've done things in British Columbia when it comes to manufacturing is something that needed to kind of happen when it came to the fast cat ferries, for example. That's I think probably the classic example of how, we had all this seed money. We obviously had this innovation, and the idea was sound insofar as, hey, who doesn't want to get to the island a little bit faster? But of course, certain elements of society were kind of wondering about the tidal wave that was headed their direction for their nice little spot on the various islands in the Inside Passage.
All the mansion owners as you come into Horseshoe Bay there.
Will innovation always be stymied by kind of NIMBYism? Yeah. Will it always be stymied by NIMBYism?
There'll always be NIMBYs, but the degree to which they're effective is the degree to which government feels like they have a mandate to carry out what they're doing. In terms of the fast ferries, I always thought, I was actually in Japan at the time, so I was a bit out of the media bubble on it, but looking at it from outside, not being subjected to sort of the political messaging that was coming from the opposition at the time on it, I thought, well, why don't you just slow the ferries down when they're coming into port? It just seemed kind of silly. Or, like if you have a property, that a multi-million-dollar property on the banks of the ocean coming in on Horseshoe Bay or any of these ferry terminals, that is going to be damaged significantly from the wake made by a ferry, I think you probably need to invest in some flood mitigation measures for your property, because there's much bigger tidal waves if there's potential if there's an earthquake just off the coast, like what we saw in Fukushima. So it always seemed like just a bizarre attempt to just try to take a shot at that government, who, from my perspective, irrespective of how much they spent, were doing the right thing and trying to manufacture boats in British Columbia. That was absolutely what we should have done, and it's absolutely what we should be doing now. And my frustration with the BC government, despite them having talked about moving towards reestablishing shipbuilding in British Columbia again, is they haven't done it, and they don't appear to be moving in that direction. Anyway, that's for a historical episode, not necessarily this one. There is a little bit of delay in your mic now as well, so sorry if I interject at what seems like an inopportune time. But I'd like to move on to another story just very, very quickly. I won't spend too much time on this, but it's also a follow-up to what we've previously reported on. Folks will remember perhaps when I reported a few weeks ago that a prominent New Democrat federally by the name of Avi Lewis, who also happens to be married to Naomi Klein, who many would argue is even more prominent. These are the two folks that sort of co-authored the, what did they call it, the LEAP Manifesto, I think back in 2015, which was introduced at the NDP convention in Edmonton, where Tom Mulcair was politically assassinated. He announced a few weeks ago that he was going to seek the nomination for the NDP in West Vancouver Sea to Sky country, which is probably the most affluent riding in the province. And I guess I don't know if they were already living out here, but they're coming out from Toronto to do it. So the latest announcement is both of them, both Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, let me just share the screen here, have landed what looks like very plum gigs at the University of British Columbia Geography Department. So is that coming up? There's a delay on your mic, so I can't see. I can't hear.
No, we got her.
Okay, good. So this struck me as rather interesting because, it looks like there's going to be an election announced any month here by this year. I mean, all the signs seem to be pointing to Trudeau wanting to pull the trigger on an election. Avi Lewis has already announced he's going to run, and then he gets hired at the UBC Geography Department, and along with his partner or wife, Naomi Klein. So it raises a couple questions in my mind. First of all, I didn't know that Avi Lewis was a geographer. Maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe the geography department is much more diverse than that. I didn't know that Naomi Klein was a geographer as well, but again, same argument. It's surprising to me that they both got jobs in the same faculty. What are the chances if you're doing a job application process that both a husband and you got two positions that you're profiling for or interviewing for, and you get both a husband and a wife team who land both of those jobs? It just makes you wonder sort of how rigorous was the interview process. It seems a little nepotistic to me. I mean, maybe nepotism is not the right word because it's not like they're hiring each other, but it just seemed kind of interesting. The second question is does UBC not know that he's going to run in this election? Do they think he's going to be around for a while? And do they think he's going to keep the job if he gets elected or during the campaign? And if not, why would you hire somebody for such a short period of time? The other interesting question, of course, is what it is that they're doing in the department. So here's the statement from the dean who hired them. I'll just highlight it here. We're thrilled to welcome Naomi and Avi to UBC to advance the urgent social, political, and economic changes necessary to address the climate crisis, says Gage Averill, Dean of UBC's Faculty of Arts. Quote, "This is a critical moment for the future of our planet, and we are committed to highlighting climate justice in all of our priorities." End quote. So, this is interesting to me in that it doesn't sound like they're going to be doing any research, right? The dean comes right out and says they're here to advance urgent social and political economic changes necessary to address the climate crisis. So he's basically saying we've hired them as advocates. And he's already my understanding of, the academy and in particular science is you're not supposed to come up with a conclusion first and then go search for research to prove it. You're supposed to do the research and then make your conclusion based on what the research produces. And here you have the dean of the Faculty of Arts already saying, this is the state we're in, and we're hiring advocates to come and advance to advocate for it. So I found that interesting. And then the whole thing is sort of mostly about Naomi Klein because she's higher profile, but then it finally gets around to saying what Avi Lewis will be doing at the Department of Geography at UBC. It says he will join the university in July as a part-time faculty member. So that answers a few questions, I guess. It's just part-time, so maybe he can do this and other things. And will teach courses focusing on social and political change, communication, and documentary filmmaking, which to me, I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an academic. I'm certainly not a geographer. I don't fully understand how those kind of classes are going to relate well to the Department of Geography at UBC. And as far as I can tell, I'm probably the only person at this point who said anything that's slightly critical of this decision. Terry. Because the response, as I saw the story come over the Newswire on Twitter anyway, was just universal celebration that these two high-profile folks are going to be joining the UBC faculty. And so everybody seems happy that these folks are coming out. But to me, it's just do they need to work at a university to advocate? Why wouldn't they work for some environmental organization or something like that? And would you pay for these classes? I guess people will. I mean, they'll probably be packed classes, but it just struck me as slightly, I mean, nepotistic is not the right word, but it just, I remember I used to complain years ago about how, bosses and the rich and the conservative elite in my mind always seem to land on their feet. They never really had any trouble getting any jobs or anything like that. And things are starting to change a little bit. And you've certainly got, these increased number of instances where people who are definitely sort of the liberal elite in Canada seem to have no trouble getting pretty plum jobs, even under conditions where, no private sector employer would probably hire them under those conditions. Like, why would you hire somebody who's gonna run off to an election in a few months, kind of thing? And why would you hire both him and his wife, and put them in the same department? I mean, universities. What can I say?
It definitely seems to me that they always seem to find a place to be, don't they?
They land on their feet.
And like, again, to your point, I didn't realize that, groundbreaking documentary filmmaking was the purview of the geography department of UBC. I didn't realize that the geography department of UBC was going to become the next PBS, and we were going to do the next set of Ken Burns revolutionary ways of looking at the civil strife over Canadian climate change. This is getting a little out of hand, to put it politely. But this is the nature. It's funny because you're getting to see it kind of from the right-wing perspective now, because that is kind of how, like, the run-of-the-mill working class right-wing or hardware store right-wing or hardware store conservative, they just kind of look up from their coffee and the chat they were having with their friends, and they look over and they see on the TV that somebody who was in one glitzy place is now in another glitzy place, and there was no delay in between. They didn't have to go on EI. They didn't have to sell anything. They didn't have to move towns. Or if they did move towns, it doesn't really matter. If you're in downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, the same restaurants, the same people, the same sort of political milieu. And then he just goes back to his coffee and goes, well, yep, that's the way of the world. Like, well, guess I'll go pay for my sins on my cigarettes, because that's the sin of the world, are the taxes I should pay on my gas, my cigarettes, my beer, my milk. That's where the sinning's happening. So I'll go do that now. I'll see you later.
Well, it's also working class left-wing union members who look at this stuff and they just shake their heads. And it's not just because these people get these plum jobs at universities. I think, as you say, working class people, however they vote, whatever their political leanings, I mean, they just look at this stuff with disdain because it doesn't relate to them at all. But they also catch wind of what these people are saying. And so the first problem, I think, is this tendency for universities now to be training activists rather than training people. And like, I would argue that universities shouldn't even just be training academics. That's one of my criticisms of universities, is that they see themselves as training more academics. Well, we don't, like, I would argue, like, there's a lot of people go to university. We don't need that many academics. Like, in fact, the economy can't sustain that many academics. We need people actually doing work, right? We don't need to train more people to be teaching in universities. We do need, people do need to be trained both in the humanities and the sciences that also work in other areas of the economy and society. Probably what we don't need is universities training activists. And it's not that we don't need activists or that activists don't need to be trained. It's just, why would we use universities to train activists? And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be activists while they're on campus. I mean, I was like the most notorious in my day student activist. I've been expelled from 3 universities in 2 countries, and one of which was for organizing a student union overseas. So I'm not criticizing activism on university campuses, but I didn't get my activism from university. I got my activism from my own politics and my own experience, etc. And I played out those activist sort of plays at university because that's where I was. And that's sort of where students do it, right? And then when you get out of university, you realize, well, the world's a lot bigger than my, the lunchroom at the university where I held a rally or something like that. And that's fine. But when you're bringing people on that are like, they don't even hide it anymore. They're not even talking about the research that they're going to do or how they're going to contribute to the university in any academic matter. They're literally just coming out and saying, we're going to advocate for the kind of climate justice that we think is necessary. And I might not even disagree with them in terms of their analysis on some of that stuff, although, I mean, I do actually on a fair bit. But universities are really struggling to maintain credibility in the eyes of the communities that they're in, especially working class folks. And this is not a way to help them maintain any credibility. So I didn't want to spend too much time on these guys, but it's just one of those things to bookmark so people are aware of it, I think.
I think you're right. And the other thing to kind of note here is that there might be nothing weaker than the political elite. So I'm just speaking to anybody out there right now who is part of this nexus that thinks that if you get the right celebrities on side, you get the right speakers on side, bring the right keynote people on side, then you can build a political movement. That's nonsense. These people all need to be paid. They all need to be pampered. They all need to be perfectly handled. And they are some of the weakest people on planet Earth. So if you're trying to build a movement, this is not where to park that boat. Find somebody else. These guys are going to get lost in the tidal wave. Let's get into actually the point that you were bringing up earlier. You said that you wanted to address the changes when it comes to BC cannabis sales. I was just making a joke about sin taxes 2 seconds ago. Why don't you bring us up to speed on what's happening there?
Yeah, just a quick report because some of the numbers have come out from the BC government's venture foray into BC cannabis sales over the last couple of years. So I just thought people might be interested to see how they're doing. Because anecdotally, what we've known, and when I say anecdotally, I just mean from the people that I talk to that are buying weed from places other than government cannabis stores, is that a lot of people were kind of resistant to buy cannabis from government store for a number of different reasons. And so anecdotally, what the theory was is that the government cannabis stores weren't doing that well, that the private sector was doing much better. And you might think that if you look at some of the base numbers. So in 2019, there were 128 private cannabis stores in British Columbia. I'm not sure whether that marks an increase or a decrease over 2018, because a lot of volatility happened around that time, and that there was a period of time, especially in Vancouver, where when Harper was still prime minister, where the federal government was adamant that it was illegal for any cannabis store to exist. The municipal government in Vancouver took a very different tact and decided, partially because they're under their own city charter, which is separate from anything else in British Columbia in particular, and they've got their own police department, etc., that there was a bit of a gray area there. And so for that particular point in time, they were essentially kind of turning a blind eye to the number of cannabis stores that cropped up. When the federal changes finally came in under the Liberal government and things were a bit more legal, Vancouver took the interesting tact of basically shutting down, or at least refusing to register or legitimize any of the existing cannabis stores that had been set up. And so the private sector sort of had to redo itself. They had to start over again. And so it took them a little while to get going. But from 2019 to 2020, the number of private stores in BC increased from 128 to 270. So that's a big increase, right? I mean, it's over a doubling of the number of stores. The number of government stores also increased as they were building new stores. So that's predictable, from 11 to 25. So also over a doubling of the number of stores. But you think, well, because there's so many private sector stores, the private sector must be doing much better. But the report that's come out shows that on a per capita basis, government stores are selling on average about twice as much as the private stores, which is interesting to me because anecdotally we had heard that the traffic was actually kind of down. So it could be that I don't know. The report doesn't get into any of the reasons by that. In fact, they say we don't know what the reasons for that are yet because it's the different areas report differently. But what was most interesting to me is that the Northern Health region posted the highest per capita sales in the province, which one of the reasons for that might be that per capita there's actually more public stores in the north. I think there's 2 in Prince George alone, and they're in pretty high traffic areas. One's in the mall, right? So that might explain it. But the stats also, in terms of higher consumption rates and sales rates in northern BC, mirror, apparently, the alcohol consumption rates in the northern region as well. So apparently, not only do we buy more weed up in the north, we also buy more alcohol. Well, that second stat doesn't need a lot of explanation. I would just say it's because northerners are made of hardier stuff and we can drink southerners under the table. But I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But more seriously, I mean, it also could, I think some people would probably say, well, there's probably higher rates of alcoholism, et cetera, and some of the social ills related to this stuff. And the people that put together this report, and it's out of the University of Victoria, they actually say, look, with higher consumption rates and the tendency that like sales are going up, but not only are sales going up, but the potency, the THC content of cannabis being sold in the government stores is also increasing, which could lead to health issues that, look, the government's going to have to deal with and might generate additional costs. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's there's no real. I haven't got any sort of lessons or anything to lecture anybody on here or any real thesis, but I just thought it was interesting for people to sort of take a look at sort of how it's progressing. And the bigger question for me is, for those who don't like buying from government stores, what's the rationale, right? Like, for me, I'm a Crown Corporation guy. I think government messes things up a lot, but I don't think that government as an entity itself is inherently the reason why things are inefficient. I think people's approach to government and particular politicians' approach to government is what makes government inefficient. Dale says, "Look at Alberta. We got a ton of stores here in LA. We have." Now, is LA short for Lethbridge, or is that actually LA? We have 39 private stores, population of 100K.
Well, I don't think it's LA in the States. I think it's somewhere in Alberta, but I don't know which part of Alberta.
Yeah. So I think what Dale was saying there is there's a lower number of stores, or maybe more, maybe the same. I don't know. So it'd be interesting to see what it is in. But basically, so the way the stats, in terms of the amount of production that's being ramped up, and again, it's not public sector production either. The weed's still being produced by private entities. Lethbridge, thanks, Dale. But in 2020, government sold cannabis products containing nearly 8,000 kilograms of THC, which apparently equals 400 million joints. So, and again, you got to be careful with these stats because it depends, who's making the joints and where you're buying them. The argument I'd make, especially if you're looking at the private sector, if you're buying joints in the West Kootenays versus Vancouver, for instance, well, you might produce 400 million joints, but the same amount in, like, if you're buying from Nelson, it might be 40 joints, because they roll them fatter there. But it's an interesting sign of our times, I think. And I thought I'd put it to you because I know you've got a different position than me on sort of whether it should be legal, et cetera. From my perspective, from an economic perspective, I think if the market is going to exist, why shouldn't taxpayers get some cut of it to try to lessen the tax burden and still be able to fund some of the services that we need? It becomes counterproductive, of course, if the industry itself starts to produce health conditions which end up costing taxpayer more money on the healthcare side.
So it's funny. It's funny that you jump to that part of the argument right away, that there could be ramifications later, because this, of course, is the old social conservative argument. It's like, why shouldn't the government be into gambling? Because it'll create gambling addiction. Why shouldn't it be into alcohol or cigarettes? Because it'll get married to the revenues from alcohol and cigarettes. And I mean, for us, you could just expand the argument, right? So we have all these physical objects, and I guess one activity, gambling, that the government likes to play around it and make money off it. It's like, well, what's to stop them from if they legalize prostitution, or if porn becomes something that they actually create revenue from? There's a sin tax on porn, not just sales tax for a subscription to your favorite porn site. No, like an actual sin tax, the same way that we do it on cigarettes, right? So there's not sales tax on cigarettes. They're inflated by like 600%. So why don't we just do the same thing with everything? And so the thing is that government will always be married to its revenues. And they always say, well, this is to cure a social ill. You need people to smoke to keep government coffers topped up. You need people to drink and gamble and now smoke marijuana to keep government coffers topped up. And so they become their own dealer and loan shark and enforcer and addict in a way, because they are all the parts of that relationship, because they need the revenue. If they don't have the revenue, they can't keep doing things elsewise because it all goes to the general revenue. There is no specified amount that goes to hospitals or schools or whatever else. It all goes into general revenue. Then it gets cut up. So I think that's where we social conservatives kind of draw the line and go, you know what? If we have to have this stuff, let it be only taxed the way everything else is taxed, and we'll have private industry do it. But better yet, for some of these items, just let it stay underground where it belongs and let the local Rastafarian make his buck, because I don't really want Trudeau's lobbyists to carve up all of Saskatchewan and replant it full of weed and just say, that's it. That's what we're doing with Saskatchewan from now on. It's just one gigantic weed farm from the U.S. border to the pine forest north of Prince Albert.
Well, I'd love to see Saskatchewan do that, but if they were to take some, because look, they seem to make good coffee, so they probably would grow pretty good marijuana too. But I would argue that they should take some advice from us in BC, and that if you're going to plant a whole bunch of marijuana crops, don't plant monocrops. Like mix it up, make sure there's some biodiversity. Otherwise, the weed won't be as good. That's what I would say. But look, your arguments are not wrong, right? That's the thing. All of these things, they have a potential social consequence. We know for alcohol in particular, there's significant social consequences that end up costing taxpayers a lot of money on the back end. And so the argument from the progressive side of the fence for public distribution of these things, and I'm a big advocate of the public distribution model for alcohol, is that I actually was hesitant to see it opened up to the private sector, because I think the profit motive in the private sector is far stronger than in the public sector. So, I mean, you've raised an interesting point, which is not wrong, in that government can get addicted to these revenues. Absolutely, government can get addicted to these revenues. Private corporations are far more addicted to that revenue, which means because they don't have any others. I mean, that's their revenue, right? And literally, if they stop selling that product, they're done. And so any of the sort of shady sales practices that would evolve or emerge because of the profit motive is going to be exacerbated. Like, it's going to be way more intensified in the private distribution model. And when would you ever get a private company that's going to make a decision to stop selling a profitable product because they're worried about the social effects that it's having? I mean, the tobacco industry is the perfect example of this, where not only do they resist efforts to shut things down, they fund research to try to counter the medical research that's saying that this stuff is killing us, right? They fund junk research, and it starts to infect
the same thing happened with marijuana, right? The same thing happened with marijuana. Like, marijuana doesn't help with ALS. That's complete nonsense. They just kept handing surveys to people while they were high and asked them if they felt like maybe this was helping. This has been well documented. Of course you feel good while you're high. Of course you think it's working. It's not working. It has nothing to do with working. It's an alleviation. So it's not actually helping anything. It's just an alleviation. And you say, yes, of course I want more. And then they use that as a statistic.
Yeah, look, I'm not a big advocate for the medical properties of marijuana. Like, I'm a recreational user at best, right? Like, I don't have any medical conditions that I would ever use it for. I do know a number of people who do claim that it is quite helpful. But, I'm not going to, whatever, I don't care. What I do know is that it's not as harmful as alcohol. It's not as harmful as cigarettes. And it doesn't produce the same kind of social costs on the back end as those things do. And people are going to buy it. And if there are any social consequences as a result of it, or health risks, it strengthens the argument from my perspective to distribute it in the public model, because it's the only model in which you can actually restrict distribution and pay more attention to making sure minors can't buy it. Like, when I go to the liquor store, if I go to the public liquor store, I'm 43 years old. I get ID'd all the time, which is wonderful. I love it. But I never get ID'd at a private store, right? And it's just one more example of how the public store is going to follow the regulations better, because the profit motive, though strong, is not as strong for the individuals. There's no CEO who is worried about whether he's going to get his bonus or not because of the profit margin at the end of the year in the public model. Plus, you don't have to pay the CEO as much, so there's not as much waste. But that, again, I mean, that's the economic argument, and I don't want to discount any of sort of the moralistic or the social consequence arguments that you do raise. But I brought it up because I wanted to try to provoke a bit of a discussion. And I'm just looking at the time, and I know you got Stuart coming on, but I did have another clip of one of my favorite musical artists, Canadian, out of out of Hamilton, Ontario, though he's probably living in Toronto now. His name's B.A. Johnson. He comes to Prince George like once or twice a year. He plays at a number of different venues. I've seen him at the Legion most recently. He's not everybody's cup of tea, but he's got a great song on this last item that maybe you can play out as I take off and you transition to Stuart. But it's just been a delight to be with you.
Absolutely. Well, let's hit play on this thing and see what happens.
Oh man, I want to get high, but I don't have time to wait for the mailman or the desire to buy it off the government. I don't smoke no government weed, 'cause I still get my weed from Steve. I don't pay no tax at the dispensary, 'cause I still get my weed from Steve. Send a text, say I'm here, garage door rolls up, Steve appears, wearing a house coat, smoking a butt, shuffling in his mom's driveway. He waves me in. I don't smoke no government weed, 'cause I still get my weed from Steve. I don't pay no tax at the dispensary, 'cause I still get my weed from Steve. Tells me about a dream he had, says it felt so real. I hand him the orange Powerade. He texted me to bring.
And I think that's about as far as we can go down that road. Perhaps before we hit copyright or something. Anyways, that was incredible. I have to admit that I agree with that guy more than I agree with a lot of other things. Sheldon Jones is saying sick moves. I definitely believe that I would rather have people buy it from the Rastafarian down the road than from the government. I'm sorry, that's where I sit. I'm not even a libertarian, but if that's what has to happen, that's what has to happen.
Well, I'll tell you what, Nathan, I'll get in touch with B.A. Johnson and see if I can get Steve's phone number for you.
There it is. Yeah, because I smoke that stuff so heavily. That's what I'm known for, the weed guy. Yeah, right. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for subjecting us to this and helping us have an important conversation about the nature of marijuana in British Columbia, marijuana consumption throughout Canada.
I betcha.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. We'll chat with you. We'll see you tomorrow. We're going to grab something tomorrow and chat a little bit about the direction of the show and that sort of thing.
Right on.
So I'll check in with you then.
Right on, man.
All righty. Thank you so much. Well, that was an experience. I'm going to readjust my headphones here. Holy smokes. Yeah, I never thought that I would be playing a pro buy your weed from Steve marijuana video on my show here, but here we are. I see we lost a couple of viewers for that one. That the people went down. They did not like that. That's fine. That's why we do the no cancel policy here at Mountain Standard Time. I guess if I could articulate my point on this a little bit, I don't smoke marijuana. Okay, I don't. So I'm not. It's not very fair, I guess, in a sense, for me to try and tell you what to do with what is now a legalized drug. I had marijuana once in university or something. I can't literally once or twice, just and just to try it out in my last year of university. I'm not proud of that fact. I don't really feel like confessing this in front of a whole bunch of people, but I did do that. And I just made me paranoid. Like I just thought I was the police. So that's why I don't smoke marijuana, because it just makes me paranoid. It makes me think that I'm a police officer and that I should arrest myself, even though now it's legalized. So that's my 2 cents on that point. And we're going to bring on Stuart Parker right away to talk about what's going on in the wide world. That's Stuart Parker right here from Prince George. Stuart?
Good to be back, Nathan. Good morning.
Good morning. You just missed us playing, I don't know, B.A. Johnson, whatever the heck his name is, about how he doesn't buy his weed from government stores. He buys it from Steve. That just happened. Aaron just subjected us to this music video. But we're here now. I know, right? in any case, let's go from that high mood into a different mood now. Some bad news out of Saskatchewan, I hear.
Yes.
I could let you give us the narrative on that, let you shape that story to the best of your ability. Go ahead, Stuart.
Well, I mean, imagine your elementary school having a large potter's field of unmarked graves. It's it's pretty disturbing. They it's 715 new children's corpses that we have unearthed. But I want us to think, and so of course the whole question is: do we celebrate Canada Day? The question is not the Indigenous people we're planning to kill next week. Should we maybe not kill them? That question's not on the table. We're going to have a big fight about a holiday and about ceremony, because that's what Canadians like to do when we find blood on our hands. It's to blame our ancestors and argue about statues and photos and pictures and ceremonies and holidays. So let's think about the other things that are going on while this announcement, while this horrifying news comes out. Yesterday, in the BC Court of Appeal, the John Horgan government, represented by the Attorney General David Eby, argued that Indigenous title does not exist, that it only exists when created by the government. That was the position that the Trudeau government, the old man Trudeau government, took in 1969. So the Horgan government has made it explicit. It does not consider the bill that it passed, where everybody got to cry together, right? All 87 MLAs passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and we were awash in settler tears, right? Oh my goodness, look at all the crying. Well, let's be clear about what those tears do. Those tears wipe away the blood on our hands. That's the purpose of the tears. So, of course, the progressives are going to fight with the conservatives about Canada Day. The progressives, are going to be crying and vomiting and breaking the plastic ashtrays or whatever, and then they'll continue doing the thing they want to do, Right, I'm working for Carrier Sakani Family Services. I was asked to look at scholarship. I was asked to look at all basic government, NGO, academic scholarship on the Highway of Tears. Now, it would cost us approximately $10 million additional dollars per year to upgrade the bus service to what the people there have been demanding since 2006. And since 2006, we've cut the bus service on the Highway of Tears. We've canceled all the flag stops. We've canceled the on-reserve stops. And the rate at which Indigenous women go missing on that highway has increased. So, and we know what increases it. It's a lack of bus service and the presence of man camps. But we're not going to pass any laws that require permanent housing for workers. We are not going to find $10 million to upgrade the bus service to what it's supposed to be. We found 100 times that much money to give annually to big oil. We have $1 billion a year we give big oil in this province, but we can't find 1% of that to prevent some murders, not 1%. So, a lot, you know what? This thing, I know that there, some, Indigenous neo-traditionalists will denounce Canada Day, but they were already against Canada Day. And this idea about these celebrations we're not having because we haven't gotten far enough out of COVID to have the big public celebrations, right? Like, This is all completely hypothetical. It's, if we could celebrate Canada Day, would we? Oh, let's have a fight about that. Let's cry and distract people and then apprehend more Indigenous kids and let more Indigenous women be murdered. That's our plan. And so I'm just sickened by this obsession with ceremony. I'll tell you, if people looking back at modern Canadians, the word they would use to describe these endless apologies and performances of guilt, right? They're all recognizable. They're what a man who beats his wife does. That's what this is. These are classic wife beater apologies, right? We're going to cry. And then the fact that, like, we've beaten the person somehow, you know, we're going to cry about that. Like it's our emotions that matter. It's our emotions we have to perform. What this spectacle is grotesque. This is utterly grotesque. We are still poisoning the water in Grassy Narrows with mercury every day, every single day. There's more mercury we're pumping into that water. And we have the gall to get all emotional about this and make this about our emotions while there are children in hospital in Thunder Bay with Minamata disease because we're poisoning them right now. So I have no time. I have no time for these stupid debates about ceremony. They are disgusting. They are narcissistic. They have absolutely no business in the discourse. What settlers should be doing is not having opinions about Canada Day and deciding whether working folks get to eat some corn on the cob and maybe light off a firecracker. No, we're gonna focus on condemning regular people who want to have a holiday, on judging them. The Horgan government should be judging itself. The civic government of Victoria should be judging itself. The government here in Prince George should sure as hell be judging itself, because our current plan, right, is to destroy a homeless encampment in which Indigenous people are significantly overrepresented with no place to send them. Some of those people are going to die. Some of those people are going to die in this heat wave because they don't have a safe drug supply. They don't have housing because we've destroyed it. And they're going to die. And and we are going to be arguing about the bloody holiday. So I have no patience with Canadians and their white guilt. And let me tell you, this particular kind of ancestor blaming, which actually doesn't even rise to the level of guilt because it's just shifting blame to people who are dead. This is part of the essence of Canadian whiteness. The tears, the guilt, the histrionics. That's how you show how white you are in this country. And it's disgusting. It is absolutely unseemly. And I find the immediate turn in the debate towards the holiday indescribably disgusting. I don't even know where to put my anger. You see, this is improper whiteness because I'm furious. I'm absolutely furious. And I know that, that is not going to register at a public policy level until we start doing what we should have been focused on all along, which is, if settlers want to do something about this, or non-settlers or immigrants or whatever the hell you want to call yourself, what we should be doing is focusing on the media outside of Canada. Because Canadian foreign policy is all based on the need to sanitize our image so we can continue performing this genocide here. So all of the sort of histrionic liberal stances we take on the international scene, every time we advocate for the rights of Indigenous people in other people's countries, every time we talk about how we're on the side of those Pacific Islanders who want to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, even though every year they've been in office, John Horgan and Justin Trudeau have increased fossil fuel subsidies, increased emissions, and then they do photo ops with Greta Thunberg. You know, this sort of nonsense. What we need to do is start hammering this country's image internationally. We need to start showing people in the rest of the world who we really are, because it's on the international scene where people can actually visit consequences on this country, like our mining companies, right, which are feared by Indigenous people from Tierra del Fuego to Alaska. Canadian mining companies are 3 times as likely as mining companies from any other country to employ professional rape gangs to commit sexual violence against Indigenous women in the territories where we're mining. That's the record of Barrick Gold and these other companies. So Indigenous people in the rest of the world are terrified of us, as many Indigenous people in Canada are legitimately terrified of Canadian industry. We need consequences to start hitting. We subsidize our telecom sector. We subsidize our mining sector. We go out into the rest of the world and we get permission to do things because of this image we've crafted. Well, we need to start hammering this country's international image so that the telecom sector starts to hurt, so that the mining sector starts to hurt, and maybe then the message will get to our governments that we want something other than tears.
Something other than tears would be nice in this country, because sanctimony seems to be a fundamental Canadian virtue. It's just simply because we're not the United States, somehow we're just a better place. I don't really know where this came from. Maybe you can help us understand how Canadians decided they were inherently virtuous just because they weren't Americans.
Well, I think there are 2 parts to it. So one part is the international part. If you're campaigning for better health care in America, of course, you're going to point to Canada and you're going to dress it up as a kind of social democratic or liberal paradise. So it is rational for American leftists to help sanitize Canada's image so that they can draw a contrast between the US and Canada in a certain light. Similarly, Europeans who wish to criticize the United States, by pumping our image up, they can use us as a kind of fake rhetorical foil. So the illusion of Canada has uses for people who are in a dispute with the United States at some level. So I understand why misrepresenting us in this way is rational for people outside the country. But we have to remember, as we are approaching Canada Day, let's talk a little bit about. So it was so Stephen Harper, one of his plans that I was really frightened he'd pull off, and now I almost wish he had, was so it's actually like we have to remember that the age we've decided Canada is, its birthday, all that stuff, those are political questions. As a historian, I can give you about 8 answers as to how old Canada was or what day it was founded, and they're all correct. And you get to pick based on, and so what governments do, right, is they pick the historical narrative that reinforces the agenda of the government. So Stephen Harper, when he got his majority in 2011, he's created something called the 1812 Secretariat. And the original plan of the 1812 Secretariat was to celebrate Canada's 200th birthday in 2014, the day the War of 1812 ended. And we were going to change the narrative of Canada, because Stephen Harper believed that Canada's values were loyalty, courage in battle, and allegiance to the British Crown, and alliance making, right? Because we fought the war with the Iroquois Confederacy as our allies, and and so Canada would have gone from being, about 125 to being 200 all of a sudden, but Canada would have been refounded with this new story. One that espoused conservative values, or at least Stephen Harper's conservative values. The reason Harper thought he could get away with that, it's actually quite funny why the plan didn't work. It relied heavily on volunteer work from U.S. Civil War reenactors, and the volunteer Civil War reenactors wouldn't do it. That the idea of them being in a war where they lose to the British was just too appalling. So he couldn't get the personnel necessary to do the original 1812 celebrations he was hoping to. But the reason he thought he could do this is because this is exactly what Lester Pearson did in 1967. He refounded the country, gave it a new flag, a new birthday, and a new set of values. Because before 1967, Canada described itself very much in the terms that Stephen Harper wanted to redescribe it, as loyal to the British Crown, as English, as stalwart in battle like we were at Vimy Ridge, blah, blah, blah. But the Liberal Party of Canada, one of its most ambitious acts was to refound the country for its supposed 100th birthday. Now, there is no correct date for Canada's birthday. It was sort of born in 1814. It was also sort of born in 1776. It was also sort of born in 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was signed. You can pick lots of years that Canada came into being. But this centennial celebration that the Pearson government pulled together replaced the old conservative vision of Canada from John A. Macdonald to John Diefenbaker, one language, one queen, all of that stuff, and replaced it with the values of Lester Pearson. And let's be clear that Lester Pearson was, we know he was like an American plant. He was largely controlled by the Kennedy administration. He was a diplomat who'd spent very little time in Canada. And what he did was he crafted a self-image for Canada that was consistent with with America's policies for fighting the Cold War. And America's policies for fighting the Cold War was to create welfare states in the countries of its allies so that anything the Soviet Union was offering people in terms of social programs, our countries would match. So we rejigged capitalism so that we had all of these wraparound entitlement programs that, of course, I think are very good. But those, oh yes, that's true. The winning of the 7 Years' War. Well done, John. So there's 1761, 1763 when the treaty is signed. Lots of potential dates, but the values that we encoded in Canada, right? Multiculturalism, bilingualism, all of these sort of diversity politics, that became the center, and we retrojected that into the past to make that who we had always been. So the Pearsonian liberal state, really in many ways, our country as we know it, is just a little over 50 years old. It was effectively refounded by Pearson and Trudeau based on fundamentally different values than it was created with. And that's a thing countries can do, and I'm not even saying it's a thing they shouldn't do. There's nothing wrong with refounding your country. The United States is an example of the danger of keeping a constitution for too long. It gets too confusing, too much stuff accretes to it. The system becomes inefficient. Countries need a good house cleaning now and then. So I don't oppose what Lester Pearson and Pierre Trudeau did, but I think it's important to recognize that who we've always been as Canadians is only who we've always been since 1967. And I like our Canada Day celebrations fine. The best Canada Day celebrations before COVID were at the PNE in Vancouver. And one of the things that was striking about it was you'd go down there and you'd realize you're actually in a different city than you thought you were. Because PNE Canada Day is 25% Indigenous in a city that's got about a 1% Indigenous population. It was actually a great time to just enjoy our food, enjoy a good time, and mark whatever it was that people were marking. The PNE's Canada Day was masterfully non-ideological because it was focused really on the provision of barbecued corn, which is good stuff. And, I think that we need some adjustment on our Canada Day now. I think we're definitely in need of adjustment, but what we should not be doing is what we appear to be planning to do, which is just have a big national cry day. I think there is, a larger phenomenon going on in this culture of men not wanting to be men. And we see it manifest in all kinds of ways. And I guess my thing is suck it up, princess. This isn't about you or your tears. Why don't we try a little bit more for some values that involve taking responsibility rather than shunting responsibility to our ancestors? And there are ways we can figure out to encode this in our celebrations or in our marking of a day or what have you. But we have to remember that these histrionic mourning behaviors are not even what we're being asked to do. It's what we're deciding to do for fear we might be asked to do something substantive.
Something substantive in this country would definitely be an improvement upon our current situation, because regardless of where one sits on the political spectrum, it's felt for many years now that Canada's been in a bit of a listless direction. As you put it, the post Cold War era has not been kind to people, conservative or liberal, progressive or traditional. And the question becomes then, what is a proper way forward for this bizarre nation state? I mean, we are here on Sovereignty TV for a reason, and this is one of the only places we can have this conversation, because the consensus out there seems to be everything's fine, never mind the fire.
Well, yes, and people aren't saying everything's fine. They're screaming everything's fine in the way that people only do when things are very, very not fine. Well, I think one of the there are big questions to ask about how we think about pluralism in Canada. I think this is what it really comes down to, is that our theory of pluralism is underpinned by this ideology of multiculturalism. And we have to remember who gave us multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is an ideology we got from the United States. It was the official ideology of the National Association of Manufacturers. And it had to do with the National Association of Manufacturers' tactics for breaking unions. So NAM was strongly in favor of people keeping their European language when they came to North America. They built streetcar suburb ghettos that were linguistically based. Here's the Polish ghetto. Here are all these things. That was how we built company housing 100 years ago. It was all ethnically and linguistically segregated. And the National Association of Manufacturers gave lots of money to to national clubs, the Swedish club, the Hungarian club, etc. And the reason for that was to maintain and magnify differences that people brought with them from the old country. So that if your union went on strike, you could bring in a bunch of Polish speakers, you could bring in a bunch of Hungarian speakers. If the Poles went on strike, you go down to the black church and bring in some black people. And this is, multiculturalism was not a state ideology. It was the ideology of the right wing of the American manufacturing sector. And like so many other parts of liberalism, we forget that at its core is capitalist exploitation. That liberalism has been so successful in rebranding itself, we forget that its main purpose is to unfetter markets in various ways. And, by making free trade agreements and the like, through things like NAFTA that create investor rights and all this stuff. And you know who opposed multiculturalism 100 years ago? Socialists, right? We got our famous old labor song, Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night. The story of this copper miner in Salt Lake City who was framed for murder because he was an organizer. Well, if our present woke liberal consciousness looked at that, they would be giving shit to Joe Hill because he wasn't calling himself by his real name, which was Joel Haglund, a Swedish name. He was a native Swedish speaker when he came to the Americas, but Joe Hill wrote all of his songs in English because he felt that if the labor movement didn't speak the lingua franca of the people, it could never break down the barriers between the different races and ethnicities so that people could do something together. Now, I'm not Maxime Bernier. I'm not saying like suppress languages or suppress culture. Of course not. But we have this discourse of diversity that recognizes diversity in very specific forms: language, costume, and worship. But we live in a society that doesn't recognize or appreciate or acknowledge diversity when it comes to class, to ideology, to region, to the things that actually are the biggest differences among us, right? We're told that, right, it's almost like being working class, if you're white, is viewed more as a disease than an identity. It's like a pathology that you need a doctor to treat or something. And it's embarrassing and something you should cover up. And I think it's really, I think that we have to acknowledge and permit the forms of diversity that exist. You look at a party like the New Democratic Party, and they have this candidate vetting thing, right? So that local people can't just choose who they want to represent them because they might make the wrong choice. And so what they have is something called an equity-seeking mandate. So if a white man has been representing a riding, and he steps down, only a person from an equity-seeking group can represent the riding. This includes being transgender, being gay, being non-white. Interestingly, it does not include being working class. Working class people are not allowed to seek equity because the party requires you to pay a $5,000 non-refundable deposit from your own money. And I was debating like the party's president about this. I said, isn't this just like US style voter suppression? It's like, well, if you don't have $5,000 ready to hand, you're not a serious person. That's the New Democratic Party of British Columbia. So what we've got here is we're actually highly intolerant of various forms of diversity. We don't care how you worship, but if that worship informs your opinion, then there's a problem. It might cause you to espouse a view that we don't like. And so what are we doing in Parliament right now? We're ramming through legislation so that it will be criminalized by the time we go into the election If a kid says, I think I'm really a girl, or I think I'm really a boy, if you say, you should really love who you are. You should really love your body. You're beautiful. All people are beautiful. That's 6 months in jail. That's 6 months in jail. You've just committed conversion therapy and you're going to jail. So we celebrate superficial and cosmetic forms of diversity that look good in a photo array. We all love a photo array with one turban, one hijab, one afro, and we set them up because the way you show your power in the North American version of whiteness is to place non-white, aesthetically pleasing bodies next to yours. That shows your level of social power as a white person. And that's a tradition that goes way back. Canada changed its immigration laws in the 50s because wealthy elites in Canada, there weren't enough black maids and nannies. And you didn't look as rich as your American cousin if your maid was white. Because the ability to have a black body in your space that you control is part of your performance of being an elite white person. So we have to remember that this photo array theory of diversity comes out of two things. It comes out of a performance of white power, and it comes out of the National Association of Manufacturers trying to break unions. If we celebrated or engaged diversity in a meaningful way where it meant different opinions, where it meant being of a different class, then, I think we might get somewhere. But this hideous fake diversity, this cosmetic diversity that we are using to paper over, a very dysfunctional society, it's repugnant, and it serves no one. I can tell you from my experiences on the left, any sane non-white person hates to be tokenized. They hate to think that they're just in the photo because of how their skin contrasts with the skin of the person standing next to them. That's a profound kind of devaluation of other human beings, an insult to other human beings. And, but we don't care if people feel insulted because the performance is for us. The performance isn't for the folks that we claim that we're serving or representing. So, how might Canada look if we talked about meaningful rather than cosmetic difference? Maybe we'd all be at each other's throats and decide to break up. That's sort of what happened in the 90s. We nearly got there. But then since then, we've backed away from those conversations. Brian Mulroney forced us into those conversations, and it shook the nation, right? After repatriation in 1982, we had 10 years of trying to have a real conversation with each other. And the consequence was we nearly broke the country. But I think the mistake was to go, well, then I guess we shouldn't talk about that again. Because you know how that works in a marriage, right? If you start talking about the real problems, it looks like you're going to break up. Don't shut up. The marriage is going to live or it's going to die based on the real conversation. But you're just postponing that conversation by kicking it down the road. Now, yesterday was the anniversary of a really important moment in that decade. It was the moment that Elijah Harper stood up in the Manitoba legislature and stopped the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord. Stood there with that eagle feather, the only Indigenous person in the legislature. They needed unanimous consent to ram through this emergency legislation. And Elijah Harper said he did not consent. For folks wondering what they might be able to celebrate next week, I'd celebrate that if I were you. It was a moment of extraordinary bravery, And it was a moment we haven't seen from parliamentarians in the 21st century. We haven't seen parliamentarians who stand up to their leaders and, under the pressure of the entire country, 10 premiers all screaming at them, hold their ground with dignity based on principle. And, what a different country it would be if our heroes were people who had taken these stances of principle. But the heroes our narrative tends to lionize are go along, get along guys. The people who are part of some big fake elite consensus. Oh, we all agreed to do this thing together that we've all actually agreed to never do. That's the fathers of Confederation. I'm with the I'm with the Métis Nation on this. The father of Confederation that I celebrate is Louis Riel. He had a vision of a meaningfully pluralistic Canada, a meaningfully inclusive Canada. So of course they hunted him down and killed him, right? That's what happens to principled people, right? That's what the Bible tells us. If you live right and tell people the truth, it should take the government a maximum of 3 years to hunt you down and publicly execute you. That's the lesson. So we're a society that isn't just not producing heroes in the present. Part of that is connected to the fact that the Canadians from the past that we celebrate are not the heroic ones. And you hear this thing. I've had some jobs teaching Canadian history. Canadian history is so boring. Nothing ever happens in Canadian history. It's a grotesque humble brag. That's what that is. It's both a lie, and that's how Canada sanitizes its history, by telling the story in such a boring way that you don't notice all the corpses of Indigenous children, right? That we'll just bore people away from this bloody and unjust past. Nathan, there may be a sound delay.
One of the parts that is kind of getting more troublesome in this. Yeah, there is a sound.
What happened to me? Did Nathan just vanish? Am I on live? Well, this should be interesting. Oh, there we go.
I was trying to correct my sound delay.
Okay.
Did that work better? Do I sound better now?
Yeah, you're all synced up again.
Okay, very good. I don't know what's going on over here, but who cares? Point being that when it comes to the Canadian experience, it really does seem like we just won't talk about serious questions. I think a case in point is even our socialized medicine or the cancel culture problem that we're having nowadays. Or you mentioned recently in a column that you wrote for the Georgia Straight that of course there's the way we filter out insurgent candidates in every party. Canada just refuses to have serious conversations. We won't be able to sustain the socialized system we have when it comes to medicine. We need to change some things inside of it in order to make it more sustainable. And at the same time, Canadians will spend $12 billion on their teeth, but then also have no idea what we should do with emergent. I don't know where that conversation starts, but it doesn't really seem to matter whether one wants to be in favor of pipelines or not. They can't have a conversation about it. So they do both at the same time. There's a protest, but then the pipeline gets bought by the government, but you can't have a private pipeline, but we won't have that pipeline, so we'll do this pipeline instead. It's all nonsense. Canada is always talking out of both sides of its mouth at the same time.
And I really think it goes back to that moment in 1995 when we only won that referendum because we cheated, right? The yes side was going to win the Quebec referendum, so we violated all the spending laws for the referendum, and the airline companies and all these businesses just threw everything at winning that referendum by 30,000 votes. And unfortunately, we took all the wrong lessons from that. We talked about a bunch of issues that had been pent up for a long time, and we nearly lost the country. And so the response was to push real debate away. Now, of course, some of this is part of a global trend. It's just that it's being felt more strongly in Canada because we were always a country, or at least since 67, a country that prioritized symbol over substance. We're now moving into a time when the world at large is increasingly prioritizing symbol over substance. And so it's magnifying traits in this society that were already completely out of control. So one of the arguments I recently made is, I might vote for the Tory incumbent in my riding. And the reason for that is this. I've now looked at enough governments in Canada over enough time to see that the more a government states that it's really important to deal with climate change, the faster it increases its carbon emissions. So if you vote for parties like the Liberals or the NDP that say that climate change is a big priority, they will frack more gas, pump more oil, and burn more coal than Jason Kenney, the climate skeptic. So you're having these debates between people who say climate is really important and climate is not an issue, but their governments are doing the precise opposite. Now, I'm not saying that conservatives are trying to reduce emissions. Let me just say that people who are honest about what they're doing are less effective at increasing emissions. That brazen liars are much better at that job. And, John Horgan increased fossil fuel subsidies by more in 3 years than Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark combined in 16 years. And so I'm thinking, well, what's the point? Like, how am I supposed to make choices if the choices are not just divorced from physical reality, but constitute the opposite of physical reality? So everybody's doing this because, frankly, and I know some of your listeners disagree with this, but I think we all know in our hearts that the climate's destabilizing, and it's scared the hell out of us. It scared us all so much that we're all reacting in different crazy ways. Some people are denying the problem. Some people are yelling about the problem. But the really scary people are people like Horgan and Trudeau with their false smiles, who know perfectly well that they're committing a crime against humanity. People who even in their own story aren't the good guy. Like, I can deal with a lot of folks on the other side because I know I can hear the story, right, that people are telling. They're the good guy because there's some kind of elite consensus that's screwing them and lying to them, and they're pushing back against that. I can get behind that. I believe that about certain issues. I just believe it about different issues. But these folks who piously quote the science and then do the exact opposite, I don't know what's going on inside there, and I don't want to look. But when you're in a society that's afraid to have a real conversation, and Canadians have always been really afraid of offending each other, when you get too afraid of having a real conversation, then it's these sociopathic monsters who end up in charge. And that's not good for anybody. Now, the capture of the Canadian political system, you did mention that. It's the single most problematic thing. We have a first past the post system, which means there are only so many mainstream parties at any one given time, right? There's just a cap because of how the votes get divided. And so you can have fewer mainstream parties than you could in a European country. And all of the mainstream parties have the same provisions to prevent their members from getting the final say on who their candidates are. And my friend Gary Shaw, I remember I was the first person the NDP used this power on. So I was about to be acclaimed as the candidate for the riding of St. Paul's in 2009. And then the office phoned me and devetted me. Interestingly, over a Facebook post about the Gustafson Lake siege in 1995, mentioning that the NDP had shot 14,000 rounds of ammunition at a group of Indigenous protesters. So the party sacked me. And my friend Gary Shaw said, you know, they're saying it's over your past statements, but it's not. This is Minority Report. This is the NDP's pre-crime division. And that's what these parties run. They run a pre-crime division. They go through a candidate's resume. They're not looking for gaffes or bad affiliations. They're looking for a time the candidate stood up to authority. Is this person getting along with their family? Are they in touch with their parents? Have they ever stood up to a boss? Have they ever dissented from a professional body? But that's the information political parties use. So the result is that only cowards can be represented in the House of Commons. People keep going, well, won't one of these backbenchers stand up over this or stand up over that? It's like, no, they're cowards because since 2003, we have systematically created mechanisms to remove from our legislatures anybody with warm blood running through their veins. We are creating a mammal-free zone in the legislatures across this country, and it shows the distance between regular people with normal personalities and the people representing them. It's huge, right? You know, politicians have always been weird people, but especially in BC, we used to celebrate that weirdness. You know, and I'll tell you, sometimes, and a lot of people, right, they just want a politics of real people, that it's actually more important to them to make sure that their MP is a mammal than that their MP agree with them about climate change. I might even be turning into one of those people. And I remember, like, one of my organizers back in the 90s, Mary Clarkson. Who had she organized before? Where did her experience come from? She was a Van der Zalm organizer. And she saw my propensity to say what I thought as being, you know, it's like, well, the Zam's out of politics. I'll go with this guy. He says what he thinks. And, you know, I think that if there's going to be some kind of political renewal in this country, some way we can short circuit this increasing delamination of our elite and our political class from the rest of society, it's going to be about something more basic and more fundamental than policy. This has become a kinds of people question. What kind of person are you? Not what specific views do you have, but are you the kind of person who's straight with people? Are you the kind of person who sticks with their friends through tough times? Like, and we're eliminating those people from everywhere except society, you know, except the street, right? You can meet those people everywhere except in positions of power in this country, because whatever's happening in the House of Commons is just a shadow of what the HR industry is doing in our workplaces, right? People keep complaining about this critical race theory. Let me tell you, none of the down-rate MBA management consultants who will do anti-oppression and diversity training for your school board has read any more critical race theory than you have. These people are HR people who are taking a couple of buzzwords from some Ivy League university and wrapping it around a project I think we can all recognize: the desire to organize workplaces where control is more important than productivity. Oh, man. Yes, well, don't you miss David Icke these days, eh? Like, he makes piles of sense compared to QAnon. Like, David Icke's meta conspiracy theory about the climate, right? Because maybe people don't know David Icke's conspiracy theory, but so David Icke used to be like the Alex Jones of the world until He was just annihilated in the 21st century by people who took his game pro. David Icke had been a pro footballer in England. He was a huge success as a pro footballer, went on to be a color man on TV, did sports commentary for a number of years, and then he became the leader of the Green Party. And then he announced he was Jesus. And then even the Green Party had to do something about that. So David Icke was thrown out of the Green Party, and he announced his big meta conspiracy theory, which is that the world is controlled by a gang of shape-shifting space lizards headed by the Queen. And the thing was, this conspiracy theory could go anywhere because the shape-shifting space lizards were trying to warm the planet. They were trying to cause climate change so that it would be more comfortable for shape-shifting space lizards. And so, but David Icke recruited all these people to his conspiracy theory because you could slap it on top of any other conspiracy theory. And so, like, there's a testimonial on his website from this woman going, you know, I live in Bristol, and every night I would fall asleep, and the entire city council of Bristol would come into my bedroom and rape me until the morning, and then they would leave. And David Icke would go, well, you know why that is? It's because they're shape-shifting space lizards. And so this explained everything. It really does get more plausible all the time, Sheldon. And so this became the meta explanation for everything. He had actually solved that fundamental problem of all conspiracy theories, right? Because my friend Brian Stedman used to take the number 20 bus in Vancouver a lot, go down Commercial Drive, and he has one of those really open faces. So he would say, guys would just sit down next to him and get into their new conspiracy theory. It just happens all the time over there. And so he had a tactic for dealing with it. He'd just look at the person and go, hey, I don't have a lot of time here. So is it the aliens or the Jews? And of course, David Icke solved that problem too. The aliens are the Jews because they're shape-shifting space lizards. So Icke was an unstoppable force. In 2000, actually, he claimed I was one of the shape-shifting space lizards. And then 13 years later, I'm on the bus and I get this phone call. This person goes, hi, is this Stuart Parker? And I go, yeah. He goes, well, I'm David Icke's lawyer. And I go, excuse me? Yeah. Yes, well, he's being sued for libel by Richard Warman. And we'd really appreciate your testimony. And I go, but he accused me of being a shape-shifting space lizard. And he goes, it's our argument that he's so promiscuous in this accusation that he can't libel people by claiming that they're shape-shifting space lizards. Anyway, I told her she was an anti-Semite and hung up. But so it is funny. And there's actually the best moment of David Icke's career is he's on TV, he's being interviewed about this. And he is really letting the shape-shifting space lizards have it for what they're doing with climate change. And and then he pauses and he goes, "Now I don't want to be speciesist about this, because really they're only doing this because they have very low self-esteem."
We're in week 12 of this show. I think we've had you on almost every week, and I didn't think we'd get here in 12 weeks, but I'm glad that we did. I'm really glad.
Man. It's just another piece of the puzzle. If you want to assemble the puzzle and figure out what's going on now, there's a lot of weird stuff to pay attention to. And if I can say one more thing about the Canadian identity is so damn tragic. It sure has no space for weird people. Like, say what you will about Boris Johnson. He's a terrible leader and an asshat and whatnot. But, like, he's obviously a crazy person. And people are fine with that. They recognize that crazy people can bring a lot to their job. Whereas Canada is so very interested in its facade, in its false boringness, that we really, in addition, like, we got to deal working folks back into the mainstream of society. we've also got to deal crazy people back into the mainstream of society because they've got something to offer. And right now, I think anybody with a view that can even be characterized as crazy is afraid of the social and employment consequences of just saying what they think. Well, they said something nice about me on the screen. Shall I ring off? I think we've gone around the houses, as the British would say.
Indeed we have. Stuart, as always, it's a pleasure. And we're so thankful to have you here. Next week, everybody has to take off. Of course, Thursday lands on a day that shall not be named, I suppose. I don't know what's going to happen with that 1st of July going to the 4th of July. So it's a false long weekend because nobody in Canada is productive after a stat. So Friday is a write-off. But Thursday is a day off. So Aaron and Stuart won't be here. We'll just have 2 shows next week. But so thankful to have you here today, Stuart.
Pile of fun. Thanks, Nathan. Bye.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that was a journey, wasn't it? We went down some interesting roads today, but important roads, I think. And I was advised by my overlords that we needed to get into what happened in Saskatchewan. And so I'm lucky that we had a firsthand interpretation, live, hot off the presses, for how to look at that tragedy and how to maybe think about it. I guess as we head into the last weekend before the summer, officially, the school summer as it is, and of course, our national holiday next week. Just a few thoughts. One, if you're a graduating student from high school, I remember my graduation all those years ago. Congratulations, and welcome to the first summer of the rest of your adult life. Don't let it go to waste on you. Have some memories. Maybe stay safe. Don't make any mistakes that are permanent. And also just think through what you want to do next. I wish I knew then what I know now, but I also don't wish that the innocence I did have in that time was taken away. So if you are a high school graduating student, keep focus, but be open to a happy summer, a final summer before the dreary adult world comes for you. Anything else to kind of announce on that count? Again, there will only be 2 shows next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. And we'll be speaking with a few different people. One of them actually, we've booked him already. We're hopeful to get Mr. Hinman, a leader of the Independent Wild Rose Party out there in Alberta, that we can kind of talk about some of the things that have to do actually with of course Canada Day and the rest of that question. Do let us know if you have any thoughts about the show. I'll just put up my email very quickly here. Do let us know if you have any thoughts about the show, any suggested guests, directions you'd like to see the show go. I'm going to have a conference about that not so distant future, just about we've talked about it at the Western a little bit, the possibility of pre-recorded shows and that sort of thing, maybe in-depth conversations with certain people. So we're interested in people commenting on the format. How has this worked? Has this not worked? We're in week 12 right now. What's working? What isn't working? We want to hear from you. So there's the email. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. I'm not a weather guy. There you go. So that's the email. Use the email. But in any case, very thankful for everybody's loyal fandom here and all the comments that we received. Today was a great day for comments. It's good to hear from Sheldon, from Claudette, from a few others as well. John, of course, Terry. Do continue to tune into the show. And finally, of course, we'll be back bright and early on Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again